Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I think it's quite appropriate that we're having this chat in Robertson, which is one of the last true bellwethers in the country, having recently turned Labor for the first time in 9 years. But we will no doubt get to that in a minute. I thought I'd just quickly introduce our panel. Lech is a writer and essayist, and if you are keen on his post-election analysis, it's just come out in The Monthly. It's a really fascinating read, and we'll get into some of that in a moment. Judith is a political historian, and Bernard is the political editor at Crikey. We are going to have time at the end for questions, so if there's anything that you'd like to ask our panellists, we'll get to that in about 50 minutes. I thought I'd start with a quote from one of my favourite political philosophers, George Costanza from Seinfeld. It's not a lie if you believe it. Which is a perfect segue, I think, for Bernard to give us his take on Scott Morrison, who has been dubbed the liar from the Shire, Scotty from marketing. Bernard, you've written a lot about Scott Morrison in the past couple of years. How much do you think his perception or notion of a liar has come into what's happened in the last 2 weeks?
I think part of the toxicity of Scott Morrison was around the fact that people really decided they couldn't trust him, and more to the point, they couldn't believe him. So whatever he said was something that people would question in a way, or be sceptical in a way that I think potentially undermined his capacity to sell whatever he was selling, whether it was selling himself, whether he was selling his policies and his promises, election commitments, that sort of thing. But that's at a surface level. I think at a deeper level, it went to people's overall assessment of his character broadly. His tendency to lie a lot was merely one aspect of a political persona that people really didn't like. They didn't like the fact that he lied. They didn't like what they perceived to be his attitude to gender issues and workplace issues. They didn't like his close relationship with political figures like Barnaby Joyce, and they didn't like his attitudes toward things like climate change and integrity. It was a kind of a part of a broad package of personal characteristics or political personal characteristics. Scott Morrison, the person, I don't know if individually as a person he's a liar or has those character flaws. We're talking about his political persona, and I think that tendency to lie a lot was part of that broad package of toxicity that he took to the election, and geez, it didn't weigh him down.
Like, you've written a lot in the past about the creation of ScoMo, the character, and in fact you've kind of tended to argue that the creation of ScoMo borrowed a bit from the creation of Albo as a persona in politics.
Yeah, well, they... sorry. Yeah, they overlapped in a weird way because Albo obviously preceded Scott Morrison and had been in Parliament since 1996, and he was sort of well known as a bit of the knockabout bloke of Parliament House in terms of being like this rough around the edges rugby league fan who loved a beer and loved the South Sydney Rabbitohs. And then there was this weird period where leading up to the whole Trump Brexit phenomenon, when there was a real craving for authenticity from a certain cohort of voters, Scott Morrison really reinvented himself in the same mould, not necessarily like directly plagiarising, but because those attributes would be appealing in marginal seats in New South Wales and in Queensland, which is where a lot of the marginal seats that decide elections are located. And so, I think one of Scott Morrison's biggest problems with the lying is that he's so good at it that it's like he becomes like he's so believable when he has such sincerity when he's completely bullshitting people that he just keeps on going and he can't sort of get out of this cycle. And the problem was that I think because of COVID, people have been paying so much more attention to politics, and it's having a lot more effect on people's day-to-day lives. People had sort of forgot, like, we've been told for so long that don't sort of rely on the government for anything, and now we really relied on the government, and so people were paying more attention, and then all these gaps between Scott Morrison's rhetoric and the actual reality kept on cropping up in a way that really irritated people on like a quite visceral level. And so when that keeps on happening for like 2 years in quite stressful circumstances, I think that's when it went. Everyone thinks that politicians are bullshit artists. Everyone thinks that politicians are liars. But it was like when it seemed like the lying and the bullshit was having like a real tangible effect on people's lives. I think that's when it became it became really toxic and led to the sort of backlash that we saw at the election.
And Judith, it's not only, I mean, for anyone that isn't familiar with Scott Morrison's background, he grew up in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. He is a diehard rugby union, not rugby league supporter. He has an AFL team. Why did he create this pseudo-larrikin, laughable suburban guy when he decided he wanted to become Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, he became Prime Minister and people didn't really know who he was. And Sean Kelly, in his book The Game, which, if anybody's still interested in Scott Morrison, I mean, that's a problem about writing a book. It'll probably be, I mean, it's a terrific book, actually. But he argues that with his marketing background, Morrison knew that he wasn't very well known. So he invented ScoMo with two characteristics, one which I have no knowledge of rugby, whichever rugby team the Sharks, was it?
Yeah, the Cronulla Sharks.
So
yeah.
the people would know two things about him. He supported the Cronulla Sharks and, what was the other one? I bet you all know. He cooked curries. No, he cooked a curry for the family every Saturday night. So that showed he was a family man. He could cook, but just on Saturdays because he had an important job. So you know, that gave him a recognisable persona. The other thing I just want to say about the lying is I think one of the problems, you know, we know politicians, lies sort of is not quite the right word. I mean, what happened is people started to realise he would say anything for political gain. So there was no evidence base to any of the claims he was making. So, for example, he'd supported negative gearing when he was Treasurer and explored the idea of some sort of small changes to the negative gearing regime. Once Labor took it up, he dropped it because he became just preoccupied with brand differentiation. And I think that was part of the problem with the climate change policies too. But also with climate change, there was and this is not just true of Scott Morrison, but there was no denial of the evidence. So the problem, I think, as well behind the lying is you start to think, where's his reality checking happening? You know, that where's the evidence base? We can't have a Prime Minister who's just sort of only motivated by political considerations, because it's like then the whole system is sort of free-floating, you know?
Bernard, do you think that explains some of what happened 2 weeks ago, that it wasn't necessarily a huge push for Albo because, of course, the Labor Party saw swings against it as well, but it was more of an anti-authoritarian, anti-everything that's happened in the last 3 to 9 years?
I think there was certainly a strong element of disgruntlement with government, with authority, which expressed itself in different ways. There was some leakage of votes to the right, not as much as I think people expected. There was certainly no repeat of what happened in 2019 with the UAP, and some of that leaked left. So it was. I think there was a sort of a sense of moving away from establishment parties. I think we kind of need a bit of to dig a little bit into the deception and the lying element, because yes, most politicians tend to lie or they distort the truth in the interests of prosecuting their case, and we begrudgingly accept that as part of politics. And there's been plenty of bullshitters in politics. And I don't use that term loosely, believe it or not. It's a term of art for philosophers. The American philosopher Harry Frankfurt wrote an essay called "On Bullshit," where he talked about the sort of the epistemological sort of bases of bullshit and how it's actually used. And the thing that struck me looking at Scott Morrison was he wasn't a bullshitter. Like Tony Abbott was a bullshitter. He'd get up in the morning, he'd say, it's why Allah's going to be wiped out by the carbon price, and it'll be a cobra strike on the economy, later adjusted to a python squeeze. But anyway, so some snake metaphor. He'd bullshit all day, but it was in the interest of prosecuting his agenda of attacking his opponents. Someone like Scott Morrison struck me as being more like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, where lying is something more fundamental. Not because maybe he personally doesn't have some sort of adherence to the truth. I don't know what he's like personally. But I think lying became more about tribalism. And Trump's the exemplar of all this. For Trump, he'd just lie for the sake of it. He'd lie when he didn't need to lie. Morrison did that too. Lying became not just a way of prosecuting the case against your enemies. It became part of tribalism. It became part of signalling to your tribe that you would say anything against your enemies in the cause of defending your tribe. And it bonded Trump supporters to him in a way that continues to really more than ripple through Republican politics in the US. And I think there was a strong element of that in Scott Morrison as well. He was willing to engage in the same sort of practice of lying as a way of appealing to his tribe, of indicating, look what I'm prepared to do in order to...
exaggerated.
Nothing else, Judith, explains why Scott Morrison would lie when he didn't even need to in the most egregious sort of way.
What's an example of that?
Take, for example, Taiwan. So he goes on radio, I think he might have been talking to Neil Mitchell, and he gets confused about Taiwan and Hong Kong. And that's completely fine. He talks about Australia's policy, he's got the wrong policy. He misspeaks. That's fine. But then later on, and actually his office begins briefing out, look, he just misspoke. We haven't fundamentally changed our policy on Taiwan, don't be silly. He just misspoke. Then he's interviewed by SBS a couple of days later and directly asked about it, and he says, no, I didn't misspeak. What I said was perfectly accurate. Then he makes another mistake again, and then later on says, I didn't make a mistake. This is a guy who's not willing to ever accept any criticism and not willing to let anything undermine his authority in the eyes of his tribe.
See, I don't think of that so much as a lie as just a sort of a denial, of just refusing to acknowledge you made a mistake. And is that a lie? I think it is. Okay, you win.
I come back to this thing that...
he's a blame shifter. That was the thing I felt about him.
But there are also those examples where he'd get told about things that he'd said, and it's the same denial, I guess, but where he would just deny ever saying them, even though they might have been extremely recent. Yeah, and he would just say, no, I never said that.
Electric vehicles was the classic one where first he derided and ridiculed electric vehicles, and then in 2020 he was asked about that and he said, I never ridiculed them. And they'd actually tweeted out a picture of Bill Shorten in this clunky old electric vehicle with the power cord trailing behind it. After he comes back from Glasgow, inexplicably, I don't know what genius in the PMO thought this up, he decides to have an electric vehicle policy. So he goes out with an electric vehicle announcement, and even the press gallery, which normally you need an act of parliament to get them to check up on lies, begins quoting back what he said to Morrison, and then he claims it's a Labor lie that he ever lied about. So first of all, you get the lie about electric vehicles, then you get the lie about the lie, then you get it's a lie that I lied, and it was a Labor lie. It goes beyond just a guy who didn't know when to stop digging. It goes to someone who is relaxed about lying and does it even when he doesn't need to, because he believes that it plays to his character and he plays to his tribe, and he's a guy who's willing to do and say anything to attack his enemy in a way that signals to his tribe that he's their leader and he's got their back.
And I'm interested to see what you think about the long-term ramifications of that. Scott Morrison famously said he never thought about a legacy. And, you know, does anyone here think he has a legacy? He's lying his legacy? I mean, there aren't a lot of actual achievements of the Morrison government that we can pinpoint. So what was the whole point of lying?
For Scott Morrison, it was being in power. It seemed to me that was all Scott Morrison ever really wanted, was to be in power. And maybe to stop some bad things happening that Labor might have done. But as you pointed out, I mean, this is a guy who changed his mind fundamentally on issues. Negative gearing, he was actually briefing newspapers that they were going to change negative gearing before during that brief phase when Malcolm Turnbull was interested in tax reform.
And most recently during the election, he criticised Labor's housing policy. Only it turns out he had the same idea only a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so this is a guy who's not really got any particular fixed beliefs. You know, he might believe broadly in, an agenda of free markets and traditional liberal values, but push comes to shove, they just get ejected. This is a guy who presided over $100 billion deficit, massive government intervention in the economy, and a permanent increase in the size of government in Australia. Not very liberal stuff. He'd argue, look, we had to do it, but I think it just illustrated the sense that Scott Morrison was about being in power, not about actually fulfilling some sort of agenda.
Well, I think it's also that he didn't actually have the skill set to be Prime Minister, in that the skill set he had, because I wrote something in the Monthly about this, which I called Power Without Purpose, which in a way agrees with you, but the skill set he had was to be the campaign director of New South Wales. And so even, I don't even know that I agree about the idea of a tribe, because my sense of him was that he was thinking like a campaign director and thinking about the different electorates and the different demographics and trying to sort of tailor messages across these different demographics, which of course leads him, if you like, to lying because they're contradictory. So it was sort of a bit accidental in many ways that it became, because he didn't really have much interest in policy. So anyway.
Judith, you've written a lot about the Liberal Party.
I have.
Given your analysis of the kind of archipelago of policy that he came up with, how has that changed from the more traditional conservative or moderate factions that have led in the past, Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott, and going back further? How has Scott Morrison changed the shape of the Liberal Party? Well,
I guess, we could say one of his legacies is the Teals. Whether or not the Liberal Party is going to be able to win those back, I think, is an open question. I think it'll partly depend on how Albanese handles them, and I hope that what he'll do is give them some wins, because what he needs to do is to make sure they hold those seats. I mean, Labor's never going to win them. The Greens might. So that's one of his legacies. And I think that one of the things I think's happening is that Australia is becoming a really quite a complicated society. So we've got a two-party system, or a two-and-a-half-party system, that's based on land, Labor and capital. They were the three parties that were formed in the first half of the 20th century, and that sort of made sense of the way the economy operated. And they weren't just, if you like, the land, labour and capital, if you like, the working class, the middle class and the people who lived in the country. They had slightly different cultural worlds. They shared a lot of sort of racial, ethnicity, other broader cultural aspects, understandings of what it was to be Australia. We're in a much more complicated society now than we were. It's much more ethnically diverse, it's more racially and religiously diverse, and it's also become more unequal in the last couple of decades. So, and we've still got these three parties having to manage that. And one way I've been thinking of trying to understand what happened at the last election was that when we had those three parties with their three blocks, if you like, the political parties, I mean, there's always conflicts of interest within capital, within the middle class, within Labor, within the country, but the parties, in a sense, sorted things out and came to the electorate with with a sort of composite policy. What we're now going to see, I think, is more of that forming of policy and brokerage that political parties used to do happening in the parliament, where there's going to need to be more we hope, sort of consensus positions formed. And I mean, I think that's a good thing, but it's something that the press gallery, I think, is not ready for. I don't think they quite understand what's happened. And I don't know that the political parties do either. But anyway.
Now, Lech, you're from Queensland.
Proudly.
I was going to say we won't hold it against you. Would you like to take a stab at explaining what happened in Brisbane, what happened in Queensland? Because if we've learned anything from the last election, or this election we've just had, is that the stereotype of redneck Queenslanders, I guess we've got to throw that in the bin.
It was really interesting, and it obviously was a complete, fairly inverse to the previous election, where there were massive swings to UAP and especially One Nation. The further north that you travelled, generally, the bigger the swing was to One Nation. And so there was quite a high expectation that maybe a similar thing would play out this time because of a lot of the sentiments around like lockdowns and vaccination mandates. And meanwhile, the Greens had been cultivating like a decent vote in like those metropolitan Brisbane seats, like even Ryan, which was a Liberal seat, which not many people were sort of talking about. It didn't just happen overnight. Like the Greens vote had been growing there over like multiple electoral cycles. So then I think that the other thing that happened was obviously you've got this teal explosion and it got a lot of media momentum, but it didn't. There weren't Climate 200 aligned candidates in those seats. So if you're a voter who felt disillusioned with the LNP, which is in Queensland their emerged party, or with Labor, the Greens was the obvious alternative. And I think that the approach that the Greens took was a lot more parochial than what we saw last time around, which was like the anti-Adani convoy going up from Tasmania and Victoria, and like even in metropolitan Brisbane there is a deeply parochial streak that goes through all Queenslanders. A lot of people outside of Brisbane and Queensland hate Brisbane. Like they see Brisbane as being sort of like an evil central bureaucracy. So anyone outside of Queensland coming up is like, it really provoked a massive backlash, which fed into those swings. I obviously the right-wing minor party vote went backwards in Queensland, and the Greens have ended up winning 3 seats. And so I think that it massively changes the complexion for the parties, because obviously the Teals are directly affecting the Liberals and really changing how they approach this next election. They can't. I don't think they can afford to just sacrifice metropolitan, traditionally Liberal seats if they want to form majority government. And the Labor also have this awakened threat, because the Greens, after winning Adam Bandt's seat, had stagnated, at least in the lower house. Like maybe the vote was going up in places, but they hadn't increased on that single seat. So now that Labor needs to be awake to this threat from the left, which I think is a real one. Like I don't think some of the people that I interviewed weren't just the caricature of rich inner city elites. There were culturally diverse service workers who were saying, I can't buy a house. The Greens really broadened their message from a purely environmental message, and they were also talking about free dental, free mental healthcare, and also housing. So I think that if they can continue to focus on that really grassroots approach, it could have a lot of it could be a massive windfall for them, and it could have a similar effect on Labor as what the Teals might be having on the Liberals.
One of the things that a lot of the Liberals that lost their seats said to me was, first off, on the first day of pre-poll, the anti-Scott Morrison sentiment was overwhelming. I think they'd all anticipated a certain backlash, and all of their tracking polling indicated he was exceptionally unpopular. But the number of people going up to Josh Frydenberg and Dave Sharma saying, look, I like you personally, but it's not enough, because the targeted campaigning was if you vote for Josh, you get Scott. If you vote for Dave, you get Barnaby. And one of the interesting things about the parochial divide is that Matt Canavan up in Queensland can say net zero is dead, and it has huge ramifications on the inner city seats that were lost to the Teals. But anything the person that was running in an inner city that said about climate change or wanting to be more progressive, it doesn't have the same play in Queensland. Do you think that's why the Nationals kept their stronghold up there, and why the Nationals were the only people that didn't lose any seats?
Yeah, there were some interesting swings to Labor in central Queensland, in Capricornia and in Flynn. They didn't quite get over the line, but they went from being like, it blew out to like a 10% at the last election, thanks to One Nation preferences going back to LNP, so former Labor voters. A lot of those preferences, One Nation's vote went down, and then a lot of those preferences also switched back to Labor, so it wasn't enough to get over the line. But I think that there could be interesting things happening in Queensland, in central Queensland, leading up to the next election. If Labor, it just depends, because Labor's occupying this space where they've very deliberately tried to placate the Hunter and central Queensland on coal mining. And so it's how they balance that against the need to, for action on reducing emissions. Can they continue to walk that line? It's going to be pretty difficult because, as I said, they've got the Greens breathing down their neck in metropolitan seats now, and I think that will give a sniff to other voters in those metropolitan seats who feel disillusioned with Labor's approach on climate change. But yeah, they could also potentially win those seats back on economic matters if they were able to sort of like cater to both constituencies, which is really hard.
It seems like at most elections we say Queensland, this election will be won or lost in Queensland, and this was said repeatedly before the most recent election, and unusually it turned out not to be the case. In the end, it didn't have that significant effect, except in the sense that Labor nearly failed to get across the line to majority government, courtesy of Fowler in Sydney, but also losing seats in Brisbane. But what I think one of the consequences, longer term consequences, is going to be that the LNP is now really the bedrock of the coalition in Canberra. I mean, its members dominate the federal coalition, and it's now got a Queensland leader. It doesn't have a whole lot of MPs from. It's obviously got quite a few, but the balance between Queensland and the rest of the country in terms of the makeup of the joint party room is tilted further toward Queensland. And there's a lot. We talk about, well, has there been a wipeout of the moderates, and some people contest that. But there has certainly been a shift of power within the joint party room in Canberra toward Queensland. And I think that's going to have very interesting consequences over this term and beyond, because like Labor, LNP has got to deal with exactly that tension between placating fossil fuel and regional communities that identify with the economics of fossil fuels, and other communities that want to see faster climate action. It's a tension for everyone, and at the moment the only people solving that tension are either Matt Keane in New South Wales, who has worked with the Nationals to say we're going to invest a massive amount in climate action, in renewables, and it's going to create lots of jobs in the regions, or the Teals and the Greens, who are in the position of being able to say, let's go really fast on climate and don't worry about the consequences. I know they don't say that, I'm stereotyping, but they're in the lucky position of being able to do that, whereas the LNP, the Liberals, the Nationals separately, and Labor all have the problem of, well, how do we resolve this tension?
And they have the New South Wales government are in a position because at a state level, the Liberals don't hold any seats in the Hunter. So it's like there's only 6 seats, like there's 3 seats in Central Queensland, 3 seats in the Hunter that are really directly affected by coal. Obviously, there's people who live in other seats who work in the coal industry, but yeah, it's interesting that so few seats can have like an enormous influence over both parties, because neither party feels like they can afford to lose any of those seats that they hold.
Judith, I want to touch quickly on women, because a lot of the Teal results were largely pushed by women. I know that historically the Liberal Party have used this kind of outdated concept of doctors' wives to describe women who may be socially progressive but a bit more economically conservative. And largely, that was what the Teal women were. They were women who primarily could have been Liberal voters but wanted to step up on issues on climate change and issues that were of interest to them. I'm interested to hear what you think about, going back to the idea of larrikins. A lot of the Liberal Party's messaging is about larrikins. It's about tradies. It's really men-targeted policies. And yet there are more professional women in Australia than there are tradies. So do you think is that one of the biggest downfalls that the Liberal Party had this campaign?
Yeah, it's a very long, complicated question. Look, I think, that when we were talking about Morrison before, I mean, that he was very blokey, and we saw him endlessly in hard hats and high vis, and I think Catherine Murphy made a comment when she was discussing this in an article in The Guardian, where she said, if you feel that Morrison is not talking to you, you're right, he's not. He's not, because he's not interested in people who he doesn't think are going to vote for you. And if you're tertiary educated, that's it. One of the things that's happened over the last, probably since Howard, maybe last 30, 40 years, is that the relationship between tertiary education and voting intention has shifted. So that now, if you were more highly educated, you're more likely to vote Liberal. Now you're more highly educated, you're more likely to vote Labor or Green. But getting back to gender, what used to be the Labor Party that was the party of blokes. That they were, and images of toxic masculinity in somebody like John Setka still get mobilised a bit by the Liberals every now and again when they want to scare you that Labor's the party of the unions. So I think, that shifted. But the thing about the doctors' wives comment is that was meant to be, when the Liberals used that was a dismissive comment. That was a comment, the doctors' wives are people who are economically secure, so they can afford to have these they can afford to virtue signal. That in the language that the Murdoch press uses endlessly. Because they don't have to worry, they've got their husbands are doctors, and the economic problems are not for them. And I think, you're quite right. I mean, women are not just wives anymore. They're doctors and young professionals, and so I think that the Liberals have been, in a sense, deluded by some of their misreading of their own history. And the other thing I think it's delusional in the way in which somebody like Peter Dutton is now saying, well, we're going to forget about the Teal seats and we're going to go after the supposedly aspirational people in the suburbs struggling to put bread on the table, is that actually there's a lot of not very well-off people living in suburbs like Kooyong, in electorates like Kooyong, and they're younger. So that, yes, there's the well-off professionals in their 50s and 60s and people in big houses, but there's a lot of people working in the hospitality industry who might have degrees and are hoping to get a better job, living in rented accommodation as the big houses get knocked down and blocks of flats get put up. So a suburb like Kooyong had an extremely high proportion of people under 30 in its demographic. So I think the Liberals are in real trouble with younger voters, and gender gets talked about, but it seems to me the generational divide that there is in the electorate has not had as much analysis as gender has.
Interesting that you talk about the legacy. Just quickly, I was taking a look at the list of the Liberal leaders' seats. So only 3 seats that have been held by Liberal leaders have remained Liberal. Menzies had Kooyong, so that's gone. Holt had Higgins, that's gone. Gorton was a senator, so we'll skip him. McMahon had Lowe, which turned into Reid, which is gone. Sneddard had Bruce, which is now a safe Labor seat. Fraser was in Wannon, which is one of the only seats that Danteen held onto with a slight swing against him. Peacock was in Kooyong again. Howard was in Bennelong, that's gone. Hewson was in Wentworth, that's gone. Downham was in Mayo, which is Rebecca Sharkey, the Centre Alliance Independent. Nelson was in Bradfield, so that's one of the other two that was kept. Abbott, Warringah, gone. Turnbull, Wentworth, gone. And, of course, Scott Morrison has held his seat of Cook. But, Bernard, it's pretty much Redder's belief that he'll leave the Parliament in the next couple of years. Do you think that there could be another backlash if there's a by-election in Cook, that the Sutherland Shire could swing against him?
Yeah, people hate it when ex-leaders sort of bail out a few months into the term. There'll probably be a swing, but I was actually chatting with someone who lives in Cook the other day, and his view was there is a level of affluence there, but it is not demographically similar to the Teal seats to the north, so it's not probably ripe for the kind of shift that we've seen elsewhere. But just through sheer, I mean, name recognition is worth a couple of points on the ballot paper. So whoever gets in, maybe Michael Tauck can come back and have a go and Cook again. But yeah, there will inevitably be a swing. The Nationals have had the same problem. I mean, some of their leaders, in fact, Barnaby Joyce winning back New England a few years back restored one of the jewels in the crown that was held by Ian Sinclair for a very long time. Tim Fisher's seat has been held by Susan Lee, a Liberal, ever since I think 2001. That was a very, very that was a three-quarter contest in 2001, and Susan Lee just won, and the Liberals threw everything in there to defeat the Nationals to get that seat. So Tim Fisher's seat's been lost by the Nationals. I think Charles Blunt's seat was Richmond, which has had a sort of checkered history since then. So there's a real sense of heartlands no longer being taken for granted, which I think is I think it's a good thing, surely, that parties are no longer just are able to tick off seats and think, right, well, we don't need to worry about those. Where do we focus our campaign strategy and our pork barrelling elsewhere?
Well, I'm so glad you've brought up Barnaby Joyce. It's amazing we've gone this long on a panel about liars and bullshitters without bringing him up. Exactly. Well, I mean, Barnaby's a fascinating character. He obviously represented Queensland as a senator, but is from New South Wales, although whenever he goes to Queensland, he claims he's a Maroon through and through. Like, what do you think is going to happen to Barnaby now? He's out of the Nationals leader? He's replaced by David Littleproud?
What did he say? He's like, I'm not actually that upset. You might think that I'm upset, but I'm actually not. Which sounds pretty. I think he was like, what's his pay gone from? It was like 400k to 180.
Oh well, the backbencher's 211.
Okay. Yeah.
Plus
So he's still doing all right, but I think that with
he's got so many children. Like, what's he going to do?
I think he's got a few overheads from his own mistakes. So I thought he would have been gone last time. Like, I thought that a man who suffers that much public shame, like, how would you recover from that? And yet he stuck around and, against everyone's expectations, returned as leader. So I don't think that's going to happen again. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see the change of leadership, because Littleproud he's a Queenslander. He's from Maranoa. He didn't go to uni, so he went straight into a bank out in Chinchilla, I think. And so he's very much going. He's in the style of the traditional national leader, which was a very sedate, sort of stately, understated sort of style, whereas Barnaby was very much beat the drum of culture wars and put on the retail politician sort of act. So it'll be interesting to see how someone like Littleproud, whether he is able to cater to Nationals voters in the same way, but at the same time, like, there's a massive fissure in the National Party as well, like between Nationals in Victoria, for example, where their seats aren't affected by coal mining in the same way that LNP seats in Queensland are so heavily based around trumpeting coal mining. that, I don't see how long-term someone like Darren Chester, and I think there's a couple of others, can remain under the same tent as George Christensen's obviously gone now, but like they seem to don't really fit in the same party. It's it's going to be really interesting to see how the Nationals go as well, even though they obviously maintained their seats and succeeded, but like there are a lot of tension points there as well.
Well, there's always conversations about whether the LNP should split again in Queensland. Do you think that could be an outcome of the election?
No, I think that there used to be talk about that at a state level as well, because the Nationals, it was a weird situation where, because Queensland has such a large regional population, the Nationals were actually the major party, and they were bigger than the Liberals, and the Liberals sort of had a small rump, to the point where they actually, I think Bjelke-Petersen at one point cut the Liberals free and still had a majority. So it was always it was always leaned more strongly to the Nationals, and that was a problem. It created a problem in metropolitan Brisbane. So yeah, I think that there's tensions there, but I think that at a state level, I can't see them winning metropolitan seats under the branding of like the National Party as like the major party. I think they need to sort of like, they still need that Liberal brand in the metropolitan areas.
I guess we should turn to our new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. He is, just like with all incoming politicians, says, I'm going to do things differently. We're going to be collegial. We're going to be sensible. We're going to change decision making. Judith, is that actually possible? Do you think that he will be able to throw off the larrikin liar, LECHERS, to use the title of this panel, to do something new, or do you think that it's inevitable?
No, I don't think let's just let ourselves be optimistic for a little bit. What I would say about Albanese in terms of, this theme about masculinity is that he's a different sort of man than we've been used to, or a different sort of leader. Like we've had, if you think, when I was watching his election speech, his victory speech, and I was taken back to Rudd's speech in 2007, and I remember watching the 2007 speech and feeling really uneasy, because it was as if Rudd thought that the victory was all his. He mentioned the Labor Party once. I replayed it to remind myself, the week after the election. He mentioned the Labor Party once, he mentioned the unions once. When he thanked the Labor Party, it was like he thanked the Labor Party for contributing to his victory. Whereas Albanese used we and our, it's our victory, a victory for my team, not a victory for me. And I think that augurs very well in terms of, so from Rudd, Julia Gillard's a different issue because she's different gender, but Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, they're these alpha males who fill up the room and think that they're the cleverest person in the room. Or I don't know whether Abbott thought he was the cleverest person in the room, actually, but he was certainly the somethingest in the room. He was the strongest and ex-boxer and the most belligerent guy in the room. And Albanese's a much gentler form of masculinity. So I suppose what we're hoping, many of us, is that will enable him to run both the party. Firstly, he's got a fantastic team. And I do think that one of the real problems for the Liberals at the last election was that, the team of the ministry was like the C team. They'd basically lost all of their talent over the last few years, whatever you thought of their values. They just didn't, people like Stuart Roberts and Richard Colbeck were just not really top draw ministers. So he's got a fantastic team, but he's experienced in managing the parliament. He managed it through the minority governments Julie Gillard, that's right, was Prime Minister, and he's got a parliament where that style might work, and so I'm optimistic, but I do think that, again, the press gallery some of it, their notion of what our notion of what a leader is has been shaped over the last 10 years by this idea that the leader has to be the guy out front. But there are different styles of leadership, and I'm hoping that that's what we'll see with Albanese.
One of the things that happened in the 90s was that the PMO became increasingly powerful. It started under Keating, who in the end, kind of, as he went down in flames in 96, was almost a one-man band. But Howard really strongly empowered the PMO. It grew substantially, and that has continued ever since. Rudd might have cut the number of staffers, but his PMO was every bit as powerful. It really came to some sort of height under Tony Abbott with Peter Credlin, but it's continued more or less ever since, and that means that you get a much less collegial style of government when the PMO is really running the show. I mean, under Julia Gillard, you had John McTiernan from the UK, straight from the thick of it, basically ringing up ministers saying, we're not doing that. That doesn't fit what we want to do. Just kill it off. That kind of really heavy-handed approach from the PMO is one that's characterised our policy making now for a long time. The idea is you've got a nice, consistent, strong message coming from government, and you don't, get it polluted by different people doing different things. But a much more collegial style of government in which you empower ministers, good ministers. And you're so right about the poor quality of the Morrison cabinet after all those departures. But if you've got a quality cabinet and ministry that you can rely on to actually do their jobs well, then you can be much more of a kind of a chair of the board rather than a control freak. And you're right that model, really, we haven't seen that for a long time, probably since Hawke. And of course, Hawke was another alpha male, but he was one who was happy to subordinate his, to be much more of a chair rather than a president. And that's going to be one of the really interesting things about this term is, will Albanese's style of leadership actually be one that maximises the opportunities of the parliament? Because the presence of the Teals, you're right, Labor will want to make sure those Teals all get re-elected, and to do that it's going to have to ostentatiously work with them and give them wins whilst marginalising the Greens.
So who do you think is going to be the Speaker? What's the rumours?
So the way that it works is that in the Senate it will be the left. So Sue Lyons, who is the WA Senator, she will be the President of the Senate, and the lower house will be someone from the right. So
why doesn't he give it to one of the independents?
He could. As someone in the Labor Party strongly suggested to me, the Speaker of the House has the highest catering budget in the building and is in charge of welcoming all the dignitaries from overseas that come and
lots of overseas
and the
trips.
celebrities and et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite an affluent position within the Parliament. Would they be willing to give that up to an independent? Now that they have a 77-seat majority, perhaps not. But
It'd be sensible, though, I think.
It could be sensible.
Yeah.
I mean, other ideas that have been floated have been to give an easy win to the independents, such as through a federal ICAC. But Anthony Albanese was interviewed in the Canberra Times today and said that he's bringing forward his own model for a federal ICAC. He won't be using Helen Haynes's. Oh. So, look, it's definitely on the table. As one of the...
Andrew Wilkie's been floated, but I would actually much prefer him to go back onto the Intelligence Committee, because he was great on that under Julia Gillard. He made that as a part of his deal with Labor, that they gave him a role on that committee, which is normally only major party appointees, and he was fantastic on that committee, and it'd be great if he went back on it, because it really needs some genuine independence.
So the two names that have been put forward for Speaker at the moment is Rob McEwen, who's from the seat of Mitchell in Victoria, who was Labor's Deputy Speaker under the last Parliament, and another one is Milton Dick, who is a Queenslander, who is brother of Cameron Dick, the Treasurer of Queensland. They're both right-wingers, and so they'll duke it out when Parliament meets at the end of July. But it is technically a vote, even though it's pre-decided, so... Okay.
I thought that the Rudd, because I was at Albanese's after party for the essay that I was writing, and the comparison to Rudd was perfect because it was the anti-Rudd speech. Like, it was like so not just like inclusive of people who didn't vote for Labor, but there was no hubris. He didn't. Yeah. It wasn't a victory for the true believers sort of thing. Like, it was he really. Because Labor didn't win a gushing landslide, it was very sort of like clear-eyed and inclusive and just like pragmatic, and I think that that's like a really good sign for where they're at. And I remember a Labor MP compared the frame of mind within Labor now to what it must have been like in '83 after the sort of trauma of what happened to Whitlam, but you had a bunch of people who also had direct experience of the Whitlam era, who had ministerial experience, who was still around, and so there was this mix of experience and then also just understanding of how badly things could go if you didn't show discipline and sort of unity. And so the Labor Party being the Labor Party, I would never write off some sort of internal ructions, but I think there's going to be a real discipline that maybe wasn't there the last time that they were elected. And, partly that was to do with Rudd's personality and the fact that he didn't run the cabinet sort of style, which Hawke did. And I think that Albanese is isn't a messiah figure like Hawke, but I think that he will really try and institute that same sort of cabinet style, sharing cabinet responsibilities and not trying to micromanage his ministers and all that sort of stuff.
And also, Rudd didn't have very deep roots in the Labor movement, which I think Hawke did,
I don't want to verbal you, but you have a line in your latest essay which says something along the lines. It was when Anthony Albanese caught COVID during the campaign, and Jason Clare stepped up to the press conference table, and I think the line that you wrote was something like, prime ministerial is a term given to Caucasian men who are photogenic. And I was just wondering, having been in the room when Anthony started off by talking about a voice to Parliament and the number, especially in Western Australia, of the diverse candidates that have now been elected to the Labor Party, do you think that this signals a kind of generational change or a shift in the way from the old larrikin style to the new idea of what a politician is?
Yeah, it was really pronounced, noticeable how... Remember how Morrison, in his speech, it was so jokey and he's taking the piss. How good is this and how good is that? I think he mentioned the Sharks.
I believe in miracles.
Yeah, I think he mentioned the Sharks. And so I thought, because Albanese being the ultimate Rabbitohs diehard, I thought that he would give them a mention. There was a lot of South heavies in the room. But he showed just a real seriousness and a real inclusiveness to the whole country. It was a speech that meant the same thing to someone in Western Australia or Victoria as what it did to someone from the inner west or outer suburbs of Sydney. And that was that's been a deliberate thing throughout his leadership. He didn't want to be pinned down as just another bloke from Sydney who loves rugby league and a beer, which is what he is. But he really wanted to send a signal that, and the Labor Party really wanted to almost decontextualise him so that people in Western Australia, for instance, wouldn't see him as necessarily prioritising Sydney. And that was a thing that certainly became the case for Scott Morrison. He became seen as a creature of Sydney and a creature of New South Wales. So I think that, there's been a bunch of decisions that they've made which nobody was quite sure whether they would work out or not, but it's certainly... He's setting it up to be just a serious Prime Minister, which is, I think, what people are sort of hungry for.
Yeah, I think one of the lines that he used continuously during the campaign was, "I'm as comfortable in a boardroom as I am at a bar having a beer with someone." I guess, Judith, do you think that this idea of popularity has taken over from the idea of respect when it comes to being electable? Because Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese really have sold themselves as someone who you'd like to have a beer with, but does that really matter? Do we want to have a beer with our politicians?
Yeah. And part of that, is, they need to get on the nightly news the way the media works. But I think there's a lot of the electorate that actually are hungry for a government that's competent. And we haven't had, my view, we haven't had a competent government for a fair while. And I think I felt on the Monday and Tuesday after the election when we saw Albanese and Penny Wong flying off to the Quad, they looked like they knew what they were doing. They weren't mucking around, it wasn't a stunt. That maybe, we've got adults running the country again. And so I do think that if we get competence back, yes, there's going to be a bit of popularity because, there is a notion that people like to see people in Parliament who are like them. I mean, it's clear with a lot of the debates about what happened in Fowler and things, that a lot of quite a strong idea in the electorate is that the Parliament has to be some sort of mirror the demographic makeup of the population, which, you know, I don't totally buy. But, you know, it's one thing, you know, you want a bit of that, but you also want competence. You know, you want people who are going to work hard and who know what they're doing and can look at evidence and can take advice and understand the way in which the world is changing.
Bernard, just before we go to questions, we should obviously talk about the elephant in the room, Clive Palmer. How the lies of his marketing campaign, the UAP, I mean, is this the most embarrassing overspend in Australian political history?
Well, surely it has to be. I mean, it was, you know, certainly no 2019, when he could at least claim, and I don't think accurately, but at least make an arguable claim that he had delivered victory to the coalition, courtesy of siphoning off Labor votes. But in terms of the overall impact, I mean, they ran candidates, I think, in every seat.
Yeah, nearly every level.
And look, a lot of those candidates never stirred from their Queenslander up in Brisbane.
Oh, yep, didn't live in the electorates they were running in.
They probably had little idea they were actually, you know, on the ballot paper. But nonetheless, that's a tried and tested strategy for maximising your Senate vote. Is you make sure you've got a candidate on the ballot paper in the House of Reps seat. But in the end, it didn't yield very much. Maybe I think they're still counting in Victoria, but I think the prospects of a
it looks like Greg Mirabella might win that seat
so
back for the Liberal
receded.
Party, but South Australia they could pick up a Senate seat.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of overall expenditure, it reflects. I think this is the second election in a row where Clive Palmer has spent a staggering amount of money that will probably be in excess of what the major parties spent, and I think, for a second election in a row, he has drawn attention to a huge flaw in our political financing and donation and spending laws. The idea that someone can simply throw, you know, Clive doesn't raise that money, it's his money. So he can do with it what he likes, but the idea that someone with a huge amount of money can seek to change electoral outcomes through sheer dint of
Excuse me, I just had to...
through sheer dint of...
Sorry.
I was going to say... Kay, do you want to go make sure she's all right? Oh, no, she's okay. She's coming back. You okay?
It's like a sort of thing has settled on my throat, the thought of Clive Palmer.
Okay.
The ultimate frog in the throat. It's like a Clive-shaped frog.
And with that, shall we take some questions? All right. We have a roving microphone. I've been told that this is being recorded, so the microphone's important.
I'll come to talk about Mr. Dutton. And will he continue to be a prize for Labor? Will he have a chance of making himself over? And will he, in fact, make it to the next election? I mean, no surprise he is leader. We think this, you know, is not very popular either side.
Yeah, the word unelectable comes up a lot, obviously, with Dutton, and I think it's always a risk because it's a word that was probably used to describe Abbott as a leader. And so while I think that Abbott probably had a more gregarious nature, at least at certain points, than Dutton, Dutton could become quite appealing depending on the political circumstances if the economy goes as poorly as what people anticipate. The problem for him is going to be appealing to the teal seats that they've lost, where and electorates with a high Chinese Australian population, which they also lost, and where he's considered jointly with Scott Morrison as having demonised that community and sort of like for political purposes. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think that he could be an effective opposition leader in the right circumstances, but he's certainly, if you were the Liberal Party, you would have much preferred Josh Frydenberg to have won his seat and to still be there, because there's a lot of people like travelling throughout Queensland, travelling throughout New South Wales during the election campaign. There are a lot of people who hated Scott Morrison, but they still, and even if they were going to vote for Labor, they still like the Liberal Party brand. I don't think the Liberal Party brand is completely destroyed. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how he balances all those tensions together.
The difficulty being no one else is stepping up to take him on at the moment, and I think that unless Josh wants to do a Campbell Newman and run from outside Parliament to be the Liberal leader, he's likely to probably take it for the next couple of years. But, you know, Josh is eyeing off Aston, which is Alan Tudge's seat, so we may be seeing him sooner rather than later. Who else has got a question?
Thanks. Clearly, the Liberal National Party underestimated the electorate and to some extent also underestimated Anthony Albanese. But I'm interested in your reflections on the media and how they underestimated the electorate.
Well, I've been a serial critic of the media through the election campaign. I think I think their overall performance was very poor. I think it poorly served their readers and audiences, viewers and listeners. Apart from the criticisms I may make of Alice's august employer, I think even amongst high quality journalists in the press gallery, there was oftentimes a lack of interest in policy, a lack of engagement with policy issues that served their readers poorly. I don't blame journalists entirely for that. There are fewer and fewer journalists these days in the press gallery and in the media generally. They have a tougher job. They are under more and more pressure to work across multiple platforms, and there are more and more sources, or more and more outside sources and interests trying to influence them. So being a good journalist these days, I think, is now much harder than it was 20 and 30 years ago. And the media landscape's obviously changed fundamentally since then. But I don't think that accounts for the fact that we get such shallow policy engagement from journalists. I understand why that's the case, but it really poorly serves readers and audiences when media outlets become, in effect, just repeating what they're given in terms of media releases with a minimal overlay of analysis. Sometimes that's all people have actually got time to do, but as I said, I think it really poorly serves. We can get onto the whole issue of gotcha questions. I think that's a separate thing. I think the first gotcha question of the campaign was actually, I think it was Andrew Clennell asking Scott Morrison at the press club about what the price of a loaf of bread was, and I thought that was a ridiculous question. The Prime Minister does not get out of the lodge and go down to Manuka Woolies and do the grocery shopping. He's the leader of the country. So the idea that is some sort of signal of how in touch you are with the electorate, I think, is silly. Anthony Albanese not knowing the unemployment rate or the interest rate clearly bespoke some sort of problem. Things changed later on, but that's got to be in service of something. That just can't be the end point. That's got to be in the service of a proper analysis of, what are we actually getting from the parties in terms of their offerings. And, every election campaign is supposed to be the opportunity to debate significant issues, and campaigns just time after time after time end up being deserts of policy discussion. And that's not all on the media. Most of that's actually on the politicians themselves, but I think the media do have some responsibility in that regard.
Like, you were on the campaign trail for a bit. What did you make of how the press pack operated?
It was quite bizarre because I'd never been to a press conference before, and I think in the essay I said
ever.
In a political realm, no. Like I'm not a trained journalist, so I was sort of this rocked up and tagged along behind the bus, and then gate crashed these press conferences. And so in the essay I said that it was like being trapped in an industrial bin with a flock of psychotic cockatoos. And I think it was different. It wasn't all the journalists. I think that where there was a difference was the TV journalists, where there was a different level of animosity coming from them because they were trying to create images for the TV. Like the press journalists seemed to be maybe less antagonistic, but yeah, it was really noticeable how. And you talk to other people who have been around for a lot longer than me, and they say that there was a difference. And there was actually, it goes to the difference between Albanese and Morrison. It's not that they weren't trying it on Morrison, it's just that his personality type is different. He can just bullshit his way out of those situations a lot better and sort of like just dissemble. Whereas Albanese, they could smell blood. He's not. There's a vulnerability there, and so yeah, I think that it's. I think that it's fair enough for him to be asked certain questions, like with the cash rate. I don't like that's a mistake by him not to know that. But when it seemed like he was getting hounded, and sometimes when they're asking questions, you're like, are they actually trying to get an answer here, or are they like trying to create images for TV? Because the way that they're asking questions doesn't really lend itself to getting like a clear-headed answer. They're sort of just like hectoring him.
What did you think, Judith, of the way the campaign played out?
Look, I didn't have strong views on that. I mean, I think the 2019 haunted the campaign. Yeah, they probably turned it off when I started coughing. Sorry about that. I think the 2019 haunted the campaign, that because people, even though it seemed to me it was for a lot of the time quite clear that Morrison was going to lose, there'd be this article that would talk about all the problems that Morrison had, and then there'd be a last paragraph where the bets would be hedged. You know, but he's a superb campaigner and he might be able to come from behind. That because people had expected Labor to win in 2019 and they didn't, they were really reluctant to call it. But there is this tendency for it to get turned into a horse race, and I think that is a problem. But I mean, it's also how much of the electorate are that interested in the minutiae of the policy debates. I think that's, you know, because if you are interested, you can. Well, you can find plenty of stuff about carbon. You can't find much about some of the problems about increased inequality that we're facing. I think you're right there. There's not.
What a depressing note to end on. Can everyone please congratulate Lech and Judith and Bernard.